Christ.
Hello and welcome to Food Tank's webinar series. My name is Sarah Small and I'm Food Tank's Chief of Staff. I'm really excited about today's webinar with Simran Sethi. She is a journalist and educator focused on food, sustainability, and social change. She's also the author of Bread, Wine, Chocolate, The Slow Loss of Foods We Love. Today, her presentation will focus on the loss of agricultural biodiversity, efforts to conserve endangered foods, and ways we can help save the foods we love. This webinar will be recorded and posted on foodtank.com later today. You can also follow along and participate on Twitter using hashtag #FoodTank. Please also submit your questions in the chat box in Sarah at foodtank.com. We will have around 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, Simran, it is truly an honor to have you here today, and I'm excited to hear your presentation. I'll give you the floor now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks everybody for joining and being back after our rescheduling. I really appreciate it. I'm in transit today, so forgive the chihuahuas you might hear in the background here at my friend's house. And these are his books, not mine. But I'm delighted to join you. I'm really most excited because the conversation publicly really seems to be shifting. And I love the ways in which people are really eager to understand a bit more about the deeper, longer stories of the foods that we love. And that's what really inspired the book. I just want to rewind quickly and state a little bit of information that can help no matter where you find yourself on the food, environmental, sustainability continuum. But I have been working on social and environmental issues for well over a decade. And I was experiencing a tremendous amount of frustration because it seemed like the conversation wasn't advancing, right? I mean, everybody who's on this call right now knows that if we had it our way, things would be very different. But we're having some of the same conversations we've been having. And we are moving forward, but perhaps in some ways not as quickly as we'd like to. So I really think a lot of this is about how we frame the story and how we have the conversations with people who wouldn't be on this call, who wouldn't be in, at a Food Tank Summit, which is where I'll be next week, and I'm super excited about that. How do we engage the people who aren't in the room? And one of the most important things I've learned throughout the work that I've done was actually something that happened over the course of a couple of appearances I made on the Oprah Winfrey Show. And in year one, I was on Earth Day. Year one, it was Leonardo DiCaprio, Al Gore, and myself. I was the C guest, as they call it. And, they're sharing information about the small changes we could make to really have an impact on climate change. Year two, it's me. Year three, again, it's me. And in year three, the producers on the show are asking, Simran, and now I'm what they call the A guest, right? Is there anything new in weather stripping? Is there anything new we can talk about, cleaning products and kind of all of these smaller conversations? And I said, no, we just need to insulate our homes. And I was with, Oprah, and we're talking about home cleaning products. I've got a pitcher in my hand of water with lemons, and there's vinegar on the table. And I thought, what am I doing wrong that these conversations are repeated year after year? Why aren't we getting more traction? And I started doing a lot of research on the psychology behind why we aren't engaging. And that's what my most important takeaway today is, of course, I want to get to the book and agrobiodiversity, but what I really want to do is start to explore the ways that we together can really break through and have some of these engagements with people who aren't in the room, as I said before, or at the table. And some of the most important information that I learned comes from Duke University, from two behavioral economists there who talk about humans existing within the finite pool of worry, or our cares existing within the finite pool of worry. Essentially what they're saying is, it's not that we don't care, but it's simply that there's only so much we can hold on to at once. And psychology bears this out. I'm going to share with you a lot of facts today, but facts don't change people's decision making. And that statistic comes from Tony Lyserowitz over at Yale University. That's not me. We are wired to respond to immediate threats in our immediate environment, or as these economists have shared, to respond to things that we already care about. So if we want to talk about advancing change in whatever way we do, we need to either frame it within people's existing cares, or we need to displace one of the cares that people already have, right? There's only so much I can worry about at once. It's 12:06 p.m. right here in New York City in my friend's apartment in the East Village, and I care deeply about the refugee crisis. I care deeply about what's going on with our political system right now. I care deeply about climate change, but I can also assure you that none of those crossed my mind in the last few hours since I've kind of navigated New York City, gotten my coffee, set up for today. And it's not because I don't care. It's simply because they weren't in my pool of worry today. And so what has been in my pool of worry is my morning coffee. What has been in my pool of worry is what I'm going to eat for lunch on the train to Connecticut. So I feel like food, which is why Food Tank is so extraordinary. Food is one of the most intimate conduits to having these conversations. So, we are right now in a challenging place. We aren't fed well. We are increasingly reliant on others to meet our demands for food, to lay out some of that framework. I'm sure some of you know this. 805 million people are hungry today. And this includes more than 1 in 5 children right here in the United States, where I'm talking to you from, who are food insecure. And that's a statistic that, when broken down by race and ethnicity, becomes even more heartbreaking. Almost 40% of African American children and 30% of Latino American children are undernourished. And here is where the conundrum comes in. It's not because we're not producing enough food. The dominant narrative is we need to engage in industrialized agriculture. We need to eat this cheap processed food because people are hungry. And I really want to upend that in the conversation that we're having right now. It's not because we don't produce enough food. In the United States, I'm going to keep using the US as the case study because I think it's the most compelling example, and the most compelling paradoxes that we see right now are that here in the United States, we're throwing 40% of our food away. Globally, we're losing about 30% of our food. But for the past 20 years, the rate of global food production has actually increased faster than the rate of population growth. So what that means is that the world produces more than 1.5 times enough food to feed everyone on the planet. And that is also enough to feed the population of 9.6 billion that we anticipate by 2050. This matters because so much of the changes that we're seeing in food and agriculture are being made in the name of feeding hungry people. But I just want to really underscore that the challenge here isn't simply an issue of availability, it's one of access, and it's one of justice. It's one of control over what's available, what's eaten, and what's grown. So food and the resources required to buy food aren't equally or efficiently distributed. More than 60% of people who are underfed live in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, which is known as hunger's center of gravity. But it's also the Fertile Crescent. It's also the place where agriculture started. And the irony is that fully half of food insecure people in the world are small farmers, smallholder farmers who are living on less than $2 a day. Because, even though they're growing food, right, they lack the means to meet all their needs through production in home gardens or through buying food. So the largest group of people in the world who are growing food, who are peasant farmers, are too poor to buy food. The person who planted this seed for me, the seed of awareness, I should say, is Anuradha Mittal, who was on the Food Tank webinar, I think it was last week. Her organization's research on land grabs is critical, and I encourage you to listen to her Food Tank podcast. I encourage you to read her work, and I encourage you to understand how the conversation we're having today is part of that bigger conversation that goes all the way to land acquisition, that goes all the way to access to capital. It seems that we have diversity in what we're growing and in what we're eating, but we're actually part of that bigger system that's in place. And we consume right now less than 1% of all the food that's available for human consumption. 3/4 of our food comes from 12 plant and 5 animal species. And I came to this information through a different kind of conversation. I was in Rome doing research on the moral imperatives for and against genetic engineering, right? What we commonly call GMOs, which we can break down in a different conversation. But I really wanted to kind of look at both ends of this story, again, because of that dominant narrative that says we have to have this system in order to feed people. And I think one of the most important things that we can do as a food tank community is keep asking why, and keep asking if this narrative that we're hearing is actually really jives with the truth, right? So we're hearing we need to create more food to feed hungry people. And then I tell you through the research that I've done, we actually have enough food to feed hungry people. So why isn't that food getting to the people who need it? Well, this is a matter of agency. This is a matter of infrastructure. So it's just kind of looking underneath the conversation. And for me, here I am in Italy thinking that we, have all this abundance, but I'm wondering, why do we need this genetic technology to feed the world? And the minute I start talking to scientists, they say to me, Simran, this is an issue. Wow, these are really dirty, you guys. I can't even believe that. I can see the screen. That's an issue in your country. What we're concerned about is genetic erosion. What we're concerned about is the loss of agricultural biodiversity. And as I said, these are issues I've been talking about for well over a decade. And I like to consider myself food-ish. I'm not a big fan of that term foodie, but I filter my whole life through food. That's how I live. That's what I'm thinking about at all times. And that's how I think we can really affect the most change. Because as I said, within that finite pool of worry, eating is something that we're all doing, and food is something we have an intimate connection to. I know for the grace of electricity, I'm with you right now. But let me tell you something. I'm not spending much time thinking about the grid. And I definitely don't have an intimate connection to the grid as much as I need and value electricity. But food, it's the juice. To me, it's a lot. We celebrate with it. We mourn through it. It's vital. And I think that's such an important way to be telling these stories. So there I am in Italy, and I'm hearing from these researchers that they're concerned about something that I am not on top of. And also that really contradicted kind of the dominant story around, or not even the story, the visuals that I thought I was experiencing around abundance. And then I went to the grocery store, and I went to the #1 grocery store in the United States, which is Walmart. And I counted 153 varieties or flavors, of ice cream. I started to look down the dairy aisle, right? So many yogurts, so many sour creams, cottage cheese, milks, butters. 90% of them come from one breed of cow. It's the Holstein Friesian. It's the highest yielding dairy cow in the world. We look at bananas. There's one banana on store shelves. We have the ability to grow 1,000 bananas across the world. In fact, we are. But the only one on store shelves is the one that that has the best texture or the best taste or even the highest nutritional value. It's the one that transports easily. It's one that until recently, has been immune to certain diseases. What we're seeing right now, the banana is the bellwether. What we're seeing right now is the succumbing of the banana that's on store shelves, the Cavendish banana, to a fungus called tropical rice 4. It's the same strain of the fungus that felled its predecessor banana, the Big Mike banana or the Gros Michel. And this is what's happening. This is what we're not seeing. This loss of biodiversity in food starts in the soil. It moves to the seeds, to pollinators, to plants, to animals, to fish. Every single place, every single strand that makes up our food web is compromised. There are 30,000 edible plant species, and we cultivate about 150. Of the 30 domesticated mammals and bird species, 14 provide 90% of our human food supply. And 75% of our food now comes again from 12 plant and 5 animal species. So, the question is, why are we growing food or raising food this way? Because, if we're putting all our kind of proverbial eggs in one basket, we're increasing food risk and we're increasing chances of food insecurity. It doesn't make any sense. We would never do this with our investments, right? You'd never go to a portfolio strategist who said, hey, Simran, here's a way to secure your future, your financial holdings for the future. Put them in 5 stocks. But that's exactly what we're doing with food. And it makes little sense because we have other alternatives. Because throughout the world, we're seeing these other alternatives, but seed by seed, we're starting to replace these alternatives, this diversity, with what we call high-yielding varieties. And that might be a plant, that might be an animal, but we think to the exclusion of everything else, what we need to do is increase yield. Now, if we didn't have enough food to feed people, that might make sense. But the place where it makes the most sense is within an industrialized system that says more is better, more is always better. But that more-ness, to create a word, is coming at a cost to taste, at a cost to nutritional value. That isn't why we're breeding crops. We're breeding crops for disease resistance, for pest tolerance, for drought tolerance. These are qualities that are certainly important, but they're not the qualities that encourage me to reach for any food in a grocery store or at a farmer's market. And again, if you're sitting there saying to yourself, again, I go to farmers markets, I'm seeing a ton of variety that my grandparents didn't have, that I didn't even see 10, 15, 20 years ago. I want to say to you this. Researchers led by Colin Corey, a team of researchers, looked at 50 years of data on what 98% of the world eats. They analyzed 50 years of data from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, where I ended up spending a good 4 months doing research for the book. And what they found is on a local level, we are seeing an increase in diversity. That's why here in the United States, you might end up seeing like a mango in a traditional grocery store. We didn't grow that here, right? We may have grown it in Hawaii, but we didn't grow it on the mainland. But that's what globalization has done. It has increased the diversity that we are seeing locally. But on a general global scale, what we are seeing is a shrinkage of diversity. We are seeing a movement toward effectively 5 crops that were called, that they have coined the global standard diet. It's rice, corn, wheat, soybean, and palm oil. And it's the same kinds and the same amounts. It's what the entire world is moving toward, and it is one of the reasons the world is now suffering from more deaths due to overweight and obesity rather than people being underweight. According to FAO, 870 million people are suffering from hunger, while 1.5 billion people are considered overweight or obese. Both of these groups of people are suffering from micronutrient malnutrition. Raj Patel, who will also be at the summit, I believe, next week, has talked about in his book, Stuffed and Starved. So I love that term because I think it really highlights the fact that we haven't lost that undernourishment, that lack of nourishment. And in part, that's caused by the global standard diet, by a shrinkage in what we are growing, and by a lack of diversity in what we're eating. We are growing now monocultures to support our mono diet. And that is not only showing up in the field, that's showing up in our intestinal flora. Like everything is changing as a result of this. Now, the challenge is, of course, that when we grow things this way, we are increasing the opportunity for one pest or one disease or the chihuahua, sorry, the diversity, the lack of diversity to kind of really be, I guess, compromised by a changing climate. Our climate models show like a wide range of what could happen. But the challenge is we don't exactly know what's going to happen. And when it comes to wiping out, crops through like a single disease or a single pest, we have evidence of that happening. We have evidence in what I just mentioned with the Cavendish banana. We have evidence from 2003 with a disease called coffee leaf rust that resulted in Honduras, Guatemala, and Costa Rica declaring states of emergency because they are so reliant on coffee as an export crop, specifically Arabica coffee. When a disease comes in that wipes it all out, you know exactly what happens. It all disappears. And we have historical evidence of this. The potato famine in Ireland, the Irish potato famine, where one third of the population was reliant on potatoes, and 1/8 of the population was wiped out as a result of potato blight. Now, there are all these kind of political forces that also come into play. I don't want to make it like a straight line. Food is complex. Food is memory, food is history, food is embedded in this whole geopolitical context of our life story. But 1/8 of the population was 1 million people that died. This was what happened with the French wine blight and phylloxera, a little sap-sucking insect that really affected the roots of the grapevines. And this is what's happening right now in Ethiopia. Climate variability, drought is what's impacting what might be a second version of the famine that happened back in the 1980s in Ethiopia. And this, to me, is the way we bring the world right back to us. We bring the world back into our pool of worries. I was talking to you earlier about running around trying to get my cup of coffee this morning. So the center of origin for coffee, the place where coffee was birthed, is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the place that also contains the greatest diversity of coffee in the world. And this brings us back to the conversation around agrobiodiversity. We need diversity in our crops, in our livestock, in our pollinators, in our seeds, in our soil, because diversity allows us to be resilient against these factors that we can't control, or against the factors that we don't yet know about. When it comes to coffee specifically, the diversity is there in Ethiopia. The birthplace is there in Ethiopia. And that is the place that is now suffering drought. And that is the place that is now losing so much of that diversity because the climate is changing. So if we don't start to consider what's happening all the way over there, we're not going to have that morning coffee that is affecting us right here. And I want to talk a little bit about conservationists and how they think about solving this problem. They think about saving the diversity in three primary ways. Ex situ, which is Latin for out of place. So seed bank is the most kind of like popular version of that story, right? Many of us have heard about the Svalbard, the global seed vault in Svalbard. That's the backup system for all the seed collections in the world. But we save all kinds of plant and animal material. We save cattle embryo in India. We save honeybee sperm in Washington State. We save seeds. We save vines. We save everything that we can. That we think, oftentimes we save what we think are the major crops. But we also say what are known as underutilized or minor crops as well. And we save this because it's important. We save this because it's important for our diet. We save this because it's economically important for a country or a state or, you know, a geographic location. But we can't save everything. We only have so much space. We only have so many human resources that can manage these collections. So we also save our foods in situ, in place. We save them in the wild, like the coffee forest that I was describing to you earlier in Ethiopia. But those coffee forests are compromised by the global standard diet. They're chopping down those forests to grow palm oil in monocultures, right? So again, that contradiction of industrialized agriculture is going to compromise our ability to feed ourselves in the future, which is an interesting conundrum, much like food waste and hunger. And so that provides a lot of opportunity for us to really look into these stories and figure out a way to affect change. So we save not only the crops that are growing in the wild that are resilient because they have to be. We haven't managed them. We haven't irrigated them. We haven't put herbicides or pesticides on them. They're tough because they need to be. And what also grows in these places are not just what we cultivate, but what we call the crop wild relatives of these plants, or the wild relatives of the animals that we cultivate for food and for other reasons. And those are critically important. It's a kind of a funny metaphor, but it helps me. If you think about your crazy, like, I don't know, like a distant family relative who's kind of off to the side there, maybe you don't invite them to every family function, but they're still part of your family and you need them. And when it comes to plants, or animals, to mix metaphors here, they might have traits that we someday need. They might have that drought tolerance that we can breed back in when we start to lose the crops or the livestock that we are growing, largely with a very limited set of genetic traits. So they're important to keep going. The third way conservationists talk about saving or preserving biodiversity is in situ on farm. So I think one of the most accessible examples is the heirloom tomato that you find in your farmer's market, which is very different from that sort of strange tomato-like thing that you find in the grocery year-round now that has no taste, that is uniform in shape and size, versus kind of the funny, super delicious things that you'll find in season in a smaller way that will definitely be coming to you locally. Because again, so much of what we find in the grocery store is there not for the reasons that I reach for food, but they're there for shelf stability. They're there because they ship well. My favorite example of this is the Red Delicious banana. The Red Delicious apple, excuse me. We can grow, like here in the United States, we grow about 100 different varieties of apples, but we see 5 on store shelves. And one of them is this thing that's called the Red Delicious. I don't understand it because it's not very delicious. There's so much gorgeousness to be had. Yet nearly every historic fruit and vegetable that was once grown here is not. Again, because we're moving toward this very narrow pool from which we access our food. The thing that conservationists haven't really considered, the opportunity, the people, are us, the eaters. The farmers who are growing diverse crops, heirloom crops, raising diverse livestock in situ, can't do that if there's no market for it. So that's where we, the eaters, come in. And I believe this is the place where we can find the most agency and we can find the most support for our work. We save these foods. We preserve biodiversity in agriculture by eating it. by savoring. You know, in all my work, like here I am, I told you in the beginning on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and I'm saying, turn off the light, put on the sweater, change the light bulb, you know, use vinegar to clean your countertops. These things are wonderful and necessary, but some of them feel scarce to people. You know, walk. I love walking. I hate driving, but here the solution is savor. Like, get in there, have a juicy life. I wrote a book called Bread, Wine, Chocolate, and that was very deliberate. It's not that we can't live without these things, but it's the things that bring more joy to my life. It's the things that I consider my staples. Chocolate has been my every birthday cake. It was my wedding cake. It was my get through divorce food. You know, it wrote every single page of this book. It wrote every word of what I shared today. I've already consumed chocolate. It's 12:27 p.m. And I can't wait to have more of it. And so I want us to move toward the things that are joyful and that are delicious and that bring people back to the table. There are so many ways to have conversations around food that feel scarce, that feel distanced, that feel abstract. And what I think we have a real opportunity to do here is talk about what binds us together, is talk about how bread, you know, or wheat isn't just a nutritional staple, it's a spiritual one. To consider that we wouldn't have that nutritional staple, that spiritual staple, my personal staple, were it not for the Middle East, were it not for Syria. And all of a sudden, considering the people who are far away from us in a different way, and considering how our futures are bound up with theirs. The biggest lesson that I learned, I spent 5 years on 6 continents. I quit my job in academia. I sold my house. I gave away my car, and I kind of embarked on this journey, and I'm still on the journey. Was that what we cherish matters, and that, like, I don't want to give this away to someone else. That I want to define what's delicious for me, and that I want to remember that food. They talk about it at FAO, at the Food and Agriculture Organization, in these abstract ways, right? Plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. It's seeds, you know. Crop diversity is about deliciousness. And I think if we can start to take back our story and reframe these conversations, we're going to have a great opportunity to do what we all know we want to do, which is to make things better, not only for us, but for farmers, for agriculture, for the planet, for the future of food. And when we adhere to the dominant narrative that says things have to be this way, we are losing not only diversity, we are losing not only genetics, right, or eroding those genetics, but we are losing culture. I'm equally concerned about the cultural erosion that is occurring when everything becomes a cookie cutter solution, when the high yielding varieties of cacao, which become chocolate, replace the diverse varieties. They are more disease resistant. They have a higher yield, but they have a diminished taste. What chocolate experts like Ed Seguin, one of my favorite experts in chocolate, he describes the flavor profile of CCN 51, this hybrid cacao, as rusty nails. And I don't want that. Like, that's not the future that I want for any food. That's not why I consume food. I consume it for deliciousness. I consume it for the long story that connects me back to the place where it was born. So I'm so grateful for your time today. I'm so grateful for the ways you understand how we eat is a reflection of how we live. And that we know that we're not here just to survive, but we're here to thrive. And so rather than depriving ourselves of this joy, I hope that we can together start to tease out the ways we can make this better. Because if you've been able to take the 30 minutes to be on this call right now, if you have the opportunity to choose a craft beer over a Bud Light, you're already part of the solution. You're already part of the group of people who can embrace biodiversity. Some people want to say, oh, that costs too much money. Oh, you're suggesting people drink fancy wine or this or that or the other. But I'll tell you what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting to you what Colin Corey, that lead researcher on the global standard diet suggested to me. He said, anything outside of those 5 things, the corn, the wheat, the palm oil, the soybean, is, he called a radical act, right? So this is about a pivot in the grocery store. This is about choosing one beer over another. This is about asking the question of who grows that food and where did it come from? Coffee didn't come from the barista and the roaster. Coffee started in Ethiopia. No matter where it ended up, were it not for the grace of Ethiopia, we wouldn't have it today. And starting to appreciate and extend our cares to those places through the lens of what's immediate, through the lens of what's right in front of us, and then tracing it back, and then helping others do the same thing. I'll end by just saying, like, when I embarked on this journey, I didn't understand that greater nourishment and kind of a deeper savoring of every aspect of my life weren't just available, but they were what I deserved. And what the loss of agricultural biodiversity, what the preservation of agrobiodiversity has shown me is that the act starts with being curious, and it starts with being grateful, and it moves from there, because the solutions to this problem aren't difficult. They're delicious. So thanks again, and we'll open it up to questions now.
Thank you, Simran. That was an amazing presentation, and our questions box is just out of control now. It's inspired a lot of discussion, and I loved, I just tweeted one of the things you said, which I really enjoyed, which was move towards the things that are joyful and delicious. I loved that. So just as a reminder to our listeners to continue to submit your questions, we will get through as many as we can today. Again, you can use your chat box or email them to sarah@foodtank.com or tweet them with #foodtank. So I'll start by asking you a question from Kristen Olson, who's in Portland, Oregon this afternoon, or this morning for her. And she asks, can you elaborate on loss of biodiversity starting in soil?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, and I just want to throw in one quick thing. Any of this that I'm talking about right now, I do elaborate on in the book. Every food, I tuck in all this information. So when it comes to soil, it's a really interesting thing because soils are critical. When I grew up, seeds were what you spit out and soil was dirt. And wow, we cannot grow good food in bad soil. The Food and Agriculture Organization is one of my favorite, they actually just wrapped up last year, and they're one of my favorite resources, just generally speaking, but also around agricultural biodiversity. It's Biodiversity International, also based outside of Rome. And you can find a wealth of resources on soil specifically because last year was their year of soils. But one of the things that was most compelling for me is recognizing that here in the United States, just to use as an example, we have 7,000 soils have been categorized here, but 1/3 of them are what's considered degraded. They're polluted. They're compromised because of the way we engage in agriculture. They're degraded. And what that effectively means is we are not allowing the soil to replenish itself. We are growing the same crops over and over again in many areas without crop rotation. Or we are using some of the most prime agricultural land that we have and using them for industrial purposes. So some of the best soils in the country have been turned into car parks or industrial sites, and they have been compromised or polluted that way. The reason soil is so important is because of nutrient uptake, of course. Anything like, we are a reflection of our environment. So is our food. So are the foods the animals that we consume. Like whatever environment they're in is going to impact not only the nutritional quality, but the taste of what's grown. In wine, this is very familiar. It's the notion of terroir, right? But we actually have terroir in everything. We are all the products of our environment, including what we consume as food. So, so my concern is that because we keep eroding the soil and overworking the soil, there's not enough opportunity to replenish it. And so what we are ultimately doing is really compromising the biodiversity that exists there and then compromising everything that kind of follows from there. So anything that is grown in that soil, anything that is fed from that soil is getting less of nutritional value. In addition to that, or nutritional uptake. In addition to that, what we are doing to kind of solve this problem is pumping the soil full of fertilizers that then, I don't know, in the coffee chapter, one of the people that I talked to talked about kind of those plants now being on steroids. So we're pumping everything up, and then they really can't function without that infusion of chemicals. So I would say what this does is it upends a system that is very carefully constructed by Mother Nature. That is one of diversity. That is one of not only giving the soils time to replenish, but allowing them to be fed by the nutrients around them, whether it be a diversified plant system, an agroecological system, or being nourished by the droppings of other animals, the kinds of things that were once allowed to flourish in those same, forage in those same and flourish in those same environments. So ultimately, that was a kind of clunky response to your question. I would say the reason this is important is because that's where food begins. And in losing that, we are losing so many qualities of what we, the consumers or the eaters, look for in what we eat.
Thanks, Simran. That was a great answer. And so the next listener asks, how can businesses also start to shift the landscape in increasing biodiversity?
I love that question. Thank you for that question, as well as for the earlier one. I think it starts, certainly, I just want to say, like, consumers, we need to start asking for this. Eaters, consumers sound so weird. We need the eating, all of us need to ask for this. I think businesses can start to look at where they're doing their sourcing from. For me, I would say the line doesn't yet feel direct. There are some protocols, certification protocols that try to address agricultural biodiversity, but none of them are doing it in a kind of overt way. If you look at Rainforest Alliance certification, shade-grown coffee, these sorts of things, they're talking about foods that are grown in biodiverse environments. And so as much as possible, I would say, if I were a food business right now, I would start to again look at sourcing and where the materials are coming from. I think some of the sustainable palm oil protocols are really interesting. I would say looking at something as diverse as the work that's being done on fish. I touch on fish in the book as well. That would be an area where we want to look to some of the places that are looking at what sustainable fish is, whether you're a restaurant, whether you're a food purveyor. It's really about, I would say, the place where that food comes into being. So something like a fair trade certification is looking at labor, right? But when we're talking about agrobiodiversity, we really need to go back to the place where the substance is being harvested from. And I would say that is the geographical location, that are harvesting methods, but it's specifically looking at place. And was the crop that's grown endemic to a certain place? Does it make sense that it's being grown there? Is, how many inputs are required to sustain that crop in a certain area? Because now a lot of it is a function of, again, in globalization, with globalization, a function of economics, right? So we're growing things in places they maybe wouldn't have typically been grown because labor's cheap, because environmental standards are perhaps a little bit, less stringent. And I would again ask, is this good for the place in which it's growing? Does it make sense for it to be coming from that place?
Thanks, Simran. And we have several questions on bananas that started to stir up some conversation as well. So I'm just going to kind of group these together and you can answer as you please in whichever order. So the first question reads, the fact that you mentioned on bananas really surprised me. Is this only the case in the US or is it the same worldwide? The next listener asks, aren't bananas going extinct? And is this because of the one type we have always carried? And then lastly, what would be a more sustainable solution to banana biodiversity? Do you believe it's a matter of exploring transport, growing options for other varieties, or reducing consumption of bananas outside of their local environment? So I know that's a mouthful, but can you address our banana questions?
Absolutely, our banana crisis. Yes. The imminent extinction, I think it said, the imminent death of bananas is what BBC said. Look, here's the thing, bananas are just this will happen. This is like a domino effect, right? We're seeing it in the banana, but we didn't see it in our cup of coffee, but it was also happening in coffee. We didn't see it in potatoes because we weren't alive, back then. But this isn't unique. It just happens to be, this is getting a lot of press because banana is in the Western world, one of our top fruits. We don't have to, the challenge comes, it's not exclusive to the United States, first of all. So I just referenced the BBC. The one banana that is the largest export banana in the world is the Cavendish banana. It's that yellow banana that we're all familiar with, or many of us are familiar with, but many of us have thought of banana singular, right? Or chocolate singular. It's these one thing. It is many things. It's just we are only seeing one in the grocery store. We are only seeing 5 varieties of apples instead of 1,000 varieties in the grocery store, right? And it goes from there. I just pulled out those examples. But sometimes we think there's abundance and it's not, like in the case of the milk, right? There are so many more opportunities here to be growing diverse varieties. If you go to some of the, I don't like this term, but I'm not sure what to use instead, ethnic stores in wherever you live, you will see things that you may not recognize as a banana, but is still a banana. Genetically is a banana. That is diverse. That is consumed by other cultures. That is something that we can start to look toward. But largely, I mean, this is standardization, right? It's that one size fits all solution to our problems because it's efficient to grow that way. It's efficient to ship that way. But one disease is now wiping out that banana. And sometimes we are able to breed in qualities and have another one teed up, right? So the Gros Michel banana was disappearing. Woo, we teed up the Cavendish banana. It was ready to go. Inferior banana, but we had it, right? We could say the same thing about cacao with chocolate. Inferior in the sense of taste. I mean, the reason I eat chocolate, but you know, it grows. It's good enough. I mean, if we were going to settle, you know, we could have done that a long time ago, and I don't want to settle. So I would say the solutions are twofold, right? There's the technological solution. There are plant geneticists working rapidly to try to genetically engineer a banana that will be resistant to this fungus that starts in the soil. Or we could continue to grow things in a diverse way, in a diversified way, so there wasn't just one version of that thing. So we actually had an opportunity through the way we were growing to reach for different kinds of traits, right? To have a banana, that is resilient to that soil fungus, that is resilient to a warming climate, but we are not growing them. And so banana by banana, seed by seed, cacao pod by cacao pod, these things start to disappear because we're growing in monoculture, because we're growing one thing to the exclusion of all the other diverse varieties that we could have. So the low-tech solution to this is embracing agricultural biodiversity. The high-tech solution is genetically engineering a banana that will take the place of the one that is, you know, I mean, this imminent death thing, you know, I don't know if we're going to get right there, but that is kind of where we're perched right now. So I feel like we could really be moving towards solutions that make sense, that support culture, the diversity of cultures, that allow people to not only sustain the diverse, you know, crop variety, but the growing traditions, the cultivation traditions, the consumption traditions, the stories of these foods. And they just, that's what's disappearing. So I hope I've answered all 3 questions there. If I haven't, Sarah, chime back in and I can fix that.
No, I think that's great, Simran. And we had time for just one more question. So you talked about the growing and the soil, and we talked about the business side. So I'd like to bring it back to the consumer side as the last question or series of questions here. And so the first part reads, how can we increase demand for greater diversity and variety in food? Is it a matter of consumer palates, or is it more rooted in the yield of each variety? And then I love this question from Don as well, and he writes, humans' sacred relationship with food needs to be taught and fostered. How is the food movement going to get people to appreciate the intrinsic value of food, given that, I think, we Westerners will one day have to devote 20% of our income to food, which he compares the current percentage to be 10 to 12%.
It's I want to touch on that really quickly and say this is one of the refrains, right? Like this is all we can afford. People need this. The United States spends less of their as a portion of our income of our money on food than any other developed country in the world. We spend less as a percentage of our income on food than we did during the Great Depression. So I really think it's fundamental to asking the question why we spend such a small amount on food and why people aren't paid enough to feed themselves well. Like this is a justice question. Going back to that idea of spending more of our income on food, like I'm tired of the refrain being like, let them eat crumbs, you know? Like let people who don't, like we as a society seem to think that it's okay for us to be eating this way. And I think that's where we need to do the work. I think that to the point of what consumers can do, we can start to, I would say for me, the low-hanging fruit is starting to get outside of those 5 things, right? That's the easiest thing. It's to pivot in the grocery store. It's to find like the good olive oil. It's to say like, wow, where does this come from? Can I find this thing locally? Can that line be shorter to a local farm that is trying to grow diverse varieties of food? In the absence of that, can I support the places where I know this coffee comes from? So there's not one single solution, and that's the challenge of the quick tip, right? That's the challenge of being on the Oprah show and saying, change your light bulb, eat locally, eat organic. It eliminates all of the nuances that are involved in how we make these decisions. We are complex beings grappling with a lot of different situations, right? And in the book, I talk about coffee and this notion of like, when we say it has to be organic, what happens when one disease wipes everything out and there's not an organic solution, a non-chemical, solution to this problem. And these are the kinds of solutions, these are the kinds of challenges farmers are grappling with every day. So I want us to take a more nuanced stance to what it means to eat well. I want us to take a more, heartfelt, like our friend said, stance to what food means. And I think that's the place to really do the work. This is intimate. We have an opportunity here that is like no other. This is an intimate commodity. This is a business relationship. This is a like story and an identity. And I think that's the way to get more people involved in these conversations and to move past some of the political divides. The thing that breaks my heart more than anything is if I see one more so-called solution to the problem being write your elected official. Because I'll tell you, the people who are in my district, they're not listening to my letters right now. They're not reading my letters. I am from North Carolina, and I am facing a lot of these challenges. And so I want to take back that power and that agency. I want to go to the farmers markets. I want to turn the label over and see what is in my food. And I want to make decisions based on that, decisions that fit my budget. I'm not doing this with everything. Let's be clear. I'm not like kumbayaing and thinking of the long journey of every single food in my life. But I am choosing wisely. And I am picking out the few things that are my staples and saying, in these areas, I will start here and I will do better. Because I know that when these things are super cheap, the people who are being compromised are the ones that have the least to lose. They are smallholder farmers. It's not the CEO. The chain, when it's long, takes me so far away from my food. Like, how can I engage with people who actually can answer some of those questions of where did it come from? How was it grown? We have EBT, we have food stamp benefits are available in an increasing number of farmers markets. And I just think like together we can fight for a system that says all of us matter, all of us should be fed well, and all of us have an opportunity to affect change here. Not just the foodies, but all of us, we the eaters.
Thank you, Simran. You said a couple important things that I just want to recap that I really enjoyed too, which was you said take back our story. And you also said the act starts with becoming curious. And I hope that inspired our listeners today. And I hope that also inspires them to listen to the panel you'll be moderating next week at the Food Tank Summit in Washington, D.C., which is sold out for in-person, but will be streamed on live stream for free at foodtank.com. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Simran. It was truly a pleasure. We really appreciate you taking the time and safe travels for you later today. As a reminder to our listeners, this webinar was recorded and will be posted later today on foodtank.com as well. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everybody. And thanks, Sarah and Danielle. Bye.